100 years ago, Argentina had one of the top economies in the world. The country was one of the richest worldwide, ahead of countries such as Germany, France, and Italy. Today, in 2015, Argentina's economy is not doing nearly so well. Its income is less than 50% of those same countries. Its economy has been surpassed by a couple of its South American neighbors that it was once able to look down on. Since the early 1900s, the economy has suffered a number of setbacks, not the least of which was inflation. Inflation has long been a problem for Argentina. Argentina's struggles with the value of its currency date all the way back to the early 1800s. At its worst, the inflation of the Argentine peso amounted to over 20,000% per year. To give you an idea of how bad that is, the cumulative inflation of the peso from 1940 to 2013 is 4,835,716,461,499%.
We can trace the problem of inflation all the way back to the presidency of Juan Perón. Perón advocated a 5-year plan for the economy. The plan entailed a massive program of expenditure that was meant to nationalize industries and public services. However, the plan needed funding, so Perón turned to the central bank as an avenue to get that money. When the Central Bank of Argentina was created, the Argentine state was not the only owner, and there was a limit on how much the bank could advance to the government. However, in 1964, Argentina was named the sole owner after Perón nationalized the bank. The restriction in advancing funds to the government was eliminated, allowing Perón to fund any deficit he ran by creating new money. His government used the bank to expand money supply and therefore generated inflation by stealing resources from the private sector of the economy. From that point on, the Argentine government was able to create more money if it should so desire.
The most severe bout of inflation that Argentina had to contend with occurred in the mid to late 1900s. During the 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, Argentina's economy suffered, and real GDP per capita fell by over 20%. Meanwhile, inflation soared. Between the years of 1975 and 1991, the average inflation rate per year was about 300%. In the 70s, it reached about 750%. In the mid-80s, it reached about 1,125%. By the early 90s, inflation had peaked at 20,000%.
After the runaway inflation of the 70s and 80s, Argentina elected to adopt a new method to slow and stop the inflation in the early 90s. Argentina set the value of the peso at $1 and guaranteed convertibility. Basically, Argentina said that its central bank would be willing to exchange any one peso for any $1. In the short run, Argentina's government did manage to rein in the inflation and induce economic growth. However, in the long run, it was not an effective way for Argentina to combat inflation, as Argentina's economy is quite different from the US's. By the late 1990s, Argentina found itself dealing with both a recession and a large amount of unemployment. By 2001, Argentina was unable to pay several of its debts, and the government had imposed a partial deposit freeze. By 2002, the convertibility regime had collapsed.
Today, inflation is still a big issue in Argentina. This year, inflation is said to be at around 40%, and prices are still rising. Businesses are unable to rely on the local currency, and so those that have contact with tourists and foreign currencies often begin to do business solely in the dollar. Kelly Brenner and her husband, Gabriel Aguayo, the owners of the Adentro Dinner Club, both have experienced the difficulties of inflation. When tourists call in 2 months in advance to make reservations, Brenner finds herself unable to confirm such a reservation because the costs are likely to be very different in 2 months. Many restaurants have given up entirely on printing menus because it's simply too expensive to print a new one every month to reflect the ever-rising prices. They've resorted to writing their menus on chalkboards instead. One boy described the difficulties of inflation to a reporter. The inflation was so severe that whenever his mother received her paycheck, he would skip school the entire day just to help her spend the money as fast as possible. Just 24 hours later, that same paycheck would not have the same purchasing power. The difficulties of inflation and of government restrictions lead to a great deal of illegal activity as well. One middle-aged entrepreneur applied 2 years ago to receive a permit to operate in a building. She still hasn't received an answer. Now, to stay in the unlicensed building, the woman has to pay a bribe, and has so far already paid $9,000. To put that in context, the Argentine GDP per capita is about $15,000 per year. The economy in Argentina is just so bad that some companies are forced to do business off the books in order to stay afloat at all. In the case of our middle-aged entrepreneur, such illegal activity amounts to a variety of things. When a customer orders an item for delivery, the deposit is recorded on the books, but the balance in cash collected is not reported to the tax authorities. This is a fairly logical choice. If one were to go through all the taxation necessary to operate such a business legally, they could find themselves paying over 100% in fines.
Adding to the problems is the fact that the government has not been at all transparent about inflation and its effects in Argentina's economy. According to the official figures released for 2013, for example, inflation was about 10.9% for the year. Private estimates tend to place that inflation rate closer to 40%. The government imposes fines on any who release figures that are different from the official ones that they release. However, at this point, few, if any, believe those official figures. It became so clear that the inflation statistics had been manipulated that the International Money Fund demanded that Argentina correct its figures. Because it was desperate for credit, the government acquiesced and released new inflation rates that were much higher than the number the government had given for the previous year. The brief moment of transparency did not last long, and after a few months, those new inflation rates reported began to decline as well.
The inaccuracy of government figures can also be seen in exchange rates. At the official rate, $1 is about 8.5 pesos, but at the black market rate, $1 is about 13 pesos. Due to the rather questionable value of their own currency, Argentines tend to view America and the American currency as particularly stable. As a result, any who work in the tourism sector or who sell to Americans almost unquestionably will charge in dollars. The government also seems to support hoarding of the dollar. There are stringent laws as to whether one can take American dollars out of the country, and the government has mandated that American tourists pay in American dollars. One Argentine joked that the three national pastimes are soccer, Malbec, and looking for dollars. An estimate as to the extent of the hoarding says that roughly $1 American out of 15 can be found in Argentina. Oddly enough, despite this, use of the government-mandated currency is mandatory for all Argentine business contracts.
There are a number of issues that need to be straightened out in order to really get Argentina back on the right tracks. First off, the government needs to quit with the lies. Transparency is an important step toward tackling the problem. After all, it's awfully difficult to fix a problem that you do not admit exists. Part of the issue is also that the government has mandated that all business transactions between Argentines be done in pesos. In 2001, the government actually froze every Argentine bank account and ensured that all of those values were measured in pesos. If the government were to allow business to be done in currencies other than the peso, then the peso would have to compete with those other currencies, which would hopefully lead to more responsible monetary policy. It would also give the Argentine people backup currencies if the central bank can't rein in inflation. Another issue the government must deal with to really straighten out their currency is the absolute lack of confidence that the people have in the currency, or the government's ability to enforce its policies. At this point, Argentines actually take pride in their ability to circumvent the government. In order for the government to successfully create and enforce laws that might impede inflation, it must prove to the people that it is able to enforce those rules. That means a major crackdown on the rampant disregard for government policy. The most important problem that needs to be dealt with, however, is the connection between the central bank and the government. The government might be able to pay back some debts as a result of creating new money, and they are heavily in debt. But other major problems will arise if the debt is paid through newly created money. However, as long as the government can basically create more money whenever it feels like it, inflation will always be a threat.